Tell me about your home.
Sure. So La Madera, or La Madera, as it's said locally, is it was named for a lumber mill town that was here in the 20s. It's sort of pinon and juniper dominant forest right next to us, and then the road pretty quickly climbs up to higher elevations where you have ponderosa pine, and that was what was primarily being logged way back in the day. I'm in Rio Arriba County. I think it is the poorest county in New Mexico. So a lot of my neighbors pretty much subsistence, whether that's agriculture or even using the forest for firewood or small scale logging or other things like that. I think because of that, a lot of people care about the forest too.
As a firefighter, you mentioned you see structural fires, and then you've seen brush fires, wildfires. How do those two types of fires differ, generally speaking?
Well, structure fires are generally a lot hotter, or at least with modern construction, because a lot of the things in houses are not wood anymore. They're plastics, they're petroleum-based products. So even paints, things like that, there's a lot of toxicity, right, in houses. So it's kind of very different for just in the general PPE that we wear as firefighters. If you're doing a structural home, you're wearing air packs that give you fresh oxygen because of the toxicity and the extreme heat. All of your gear is a lot heavier, your bunker gear. And it's generally more contained, right? So it's in one, like a lot or just a couple of houses, and you're focusing all of your attention on that. So it's sort of, you have time to set up all your apparatus around and spray water on it until it's out, or let part of it burn if that's the best decision. But and there's more hazards. Usually there's gas lines, there's power lines. In rural areas, there's propane tanks, all these different hazards that aren't really part of the wildfire wildland scene as much. That's much more faster moving. There's not a defined edge of where it's going to stop. Winds make much more of a difference at that point because they can move so fast, and it's just a totally different thing.
Well, this is a really interesting time to talk to someone who fights fires in New Mexico because, of course, of the historic fires happening there. I know that the Midnight Fire was the closest to you. Is that right? To your property?
It was within about 4 miles of both the Vallecitos fire station as well as La Madera, where I live. And so we were under the set evacuation orders, where there's ready, set, and then go as evacuation. So
many people have no idea what that must feel like, both as a property owner and, of course, even fewer as a firefighter. When you hear those warnings, what does that feel like? Can you actually, if there's a fire 4 miles away, what does that look like, feel like, smell like?
In the height of it, when the fire first started and we were the most concerned with it, we were getting ash falling, we were getting pieces of you could see it was ponderosa bark. They were like 1-inch squares that were just landing of like charcoal from the forest. So it was really the color changes in the atmosphere. You get this really red, strange light because of all the smoke. And it's a really surreal experience. I think it just puts things in perspective, where it wasn't so much that we were afraid of what was going to happen. It's just the immediacy of, oh, we might have to do something. And the things that matter, you look at all the stuff that you've accumulated and what would you take with you, what you could get in your car.
At any point in that sort of initial state of maybe alarm or, thinking about what's important, at what point does the ecologist voice in your head kick in?
Oh, it kind of all the time, because I know the area where the forest fire was burning up there, and whether it's for the rare recreation of going to mountain bike in that area, or more often like cut firewood for the winter up there or something like that, it's it, it's a beautiful spot, and all the wildlife that gets displaced, it definitely is. Let me back up. The Midnight Fire, which was close, was started by lightning, so that makes it feel, um, I guess, a little bit better that it wasn't directly caused by humans, but it's still burning and kind of taking out whatever's in its path until it slows down from running out of fuel or getting more moisture and sombering.
Generally speaking, how does the fire behave out there?
It has been interesting, and working with the Forest Service some to kind of, uh, and I can barely even speak about it being such a newbie, but just with the amount of timber loading or the fuels that are in forest, if it gets hot enough to start those on fire, it's going to be a lot faster and a lot hotter, which will be more destructive to everything left behind. I think some of the historical fires with it rolling through these areas, and Ponderosa pine specifically, I think has a history of having kind of this relationship with fire where it's somewhat tolerant to the heat, so that the low grass fires would come through and burn out all the understory, and then kind of leave more of an open forest, and the trees wouldn't die, which the Forest Service has been trying to, with some of these prescribed burns, implement more of that practice in place, which I think is a good thing. Like, managing versus not managing, it's kind of a question in humans' existence, right? Like, um, how do we do that responsibly? Can we do it responsibly? But if we are going to live in a place and be concerned about the outcome, i.e., is it going to burn our towns or things like that, I think we do have to manage it in some form.
Just to jump back to the Midnight Fire, were you involved in trying to control that fire, and what did you do, and how was it kept under control yet still allowed to burn, so that it could do the ecosystem services that fire needs to do?
Well, the area where it started, there was a lot of fuel and it hadn't burned for a long time. So it was really hot and it started moving very rapidly. I think luckily for us, in these small communities, they had a lot of resources at the Calf Canyon Hermit's Peak Fire that were just sort of slowing down or that were available. So we had 200 to 300 firefighters in a day and a half here. We had multiple planes and helicopters, um, and probably the air support made the biggest difference in the quick action of them getting here. So directly as the Vallecitos department, our response was just sort of going to meetings, trying to support if we could with our apparatus or sourcing water for folks if they needed it. But we didn't actually go out and fight any of the fires. It was more preparation if they would get past the fire lines and then start coming into some of the neighboring towns, then we would be, as ready as good as we could to protect homes and property.
Is the newer, really older approach of letting the fire burn, when you know that the human communities are protected, is that sort of where we are now with the Midnight Fire? With that, are they just kind of letting it burn itself out, but kind of minding its edges?
Well, the Midnight Fire was big enough that obviously we brought in, or the forest brought in a lot of resources to contain it because of the conditions were so dry.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, one of those stories is the Midnight Fire burned through a former kind of prescribed burn area that was in 2019. I think it was called the Francisquito Fire. And once it hit that area that had already been burned in 2019, it slowed way down, it spread out, and they were able to contain it within that area. So it was kind of a positive story of, if prescribed burns are done at the right time and things go well, it can have a good outcome because those trees are still living in that area, and it just kind of burned through the excess grass and light understory.
I'm sure you can't help but think about, the what ifs. Um, and I'm just wondering, if the fire were to have burned through your community, You mentioned how sort of vulnerable that community is and how reliant they are on the forest. Like, what do you think that would have meant for you and your community members?
Yeah, disasters, I think whether it's floods or weather related or fires, they all seem to have a similar, it's like a big shift, right? Where maybe you get displaced, maybe you move somewhere else, you start a new life, or you pick up what you have and start over. And it's a very real moment that's kind of, I think, ties humanity together rather than at some level, rather than ripping it apart, because the people can kind of come together over a common cause rather than bickering about things that really don't matter at the end of the day.
What have you seen in terms of the way the landscape recovers or regenerates after a fire like that?
There've been countless fires here, right? I've only been in this community for 12 years, and during that time, there's been maybe two or three fires, and the most I think kind of critical period after the fire is out is what sort of monsoon or rain period comes through afterwards, because there's usually flooding that follows these areas that have been burned because of the sort of hydrophobic soils. At that point, there's nothing to soak into, no organic material really in a lot of places. So once it goes through that, then things recover pretty quickly. It is amazing to see grasses come in and seed saplings and things like that. And there is the loss of the larger trees a lot of times, but it sort of feels like it's just part of the process.
Wearing the hat of somebody who works in the environmental field and understands ecosystem processes, somebody who's a landowner in a fire-prone area, and somebody who actually volunteers to protect communities from wildfires. You know, if you could write the policy or the protocol for how we manage or deal with fire, in our world, what would you recommend? Could you just
You're not gonna put me on the spot, are you, Amy? Um, I in no way feel qualified to kind of answer that kind of broad question. Like most decisions that affect multiple communities, multiple resources, whether it's water and habitat for animals, all these things. There's no way that all the people will be satisfied that interact with those areas. That's, in my experience, number one. There will always be people who disagree about the decisions. As far as like possibly bigger questions of like what happens to the ecology after we've made decisions, I kind of think it's more resilient than we think. Like the resiliency we may not notice because we're trying to look for something else. We're trying to see it fit into whether it's our home area and we want to look at a ridgeline in a certain way, or see animals, larger animals versus all the smaller creatures that are out there. I think for me, it's just kind of humbling that we're smaller than a lot of these processes. And there's a lot of us on the planet, so we do have a huge, huge impact. But in no way will I ever try to make policy on how it should be done.
how can we coexist with fire? Can we?
I think we can. For me, taking away the fear part of fire has been really healthy in my life, where it does a lot of good things while it does things that are seemingly impossible to change. And just like analogy of sometimes we have too much stuff and we need to clean it out. Well, if we don't do it, it's going to eventually um, probably impact our lives in a negative way. And fire kind of does that for us. And that the fire isn't all bad, or it's not good or bad. It's just it's what happens sometimes, and it's sort of the mystery of when it happens. I don't know if my pager is going to go off in the middle of the night or in the afternoon when I'm on a call with biohabitats. It's just this unknown thing, and having total respect for fire, and but not really being fearful for what it's going to cause has been helpful for me.
Wearing any or all of your hats, are there any other thoughts, feelings that you are comfortable sharing.
I would say my experiences with fire have made me realize the importance of time. Like fires always start really small or relatively small to the size that they get afterwards. If someone were to have a very small fire at their place that they can put out safely while it's really small, it makes a huge difference versus you wait 10 minutes and then it's big enough that everything's lost. And it kind of makes me think too that in nature we need to act fairly soon, sometimes sooner than we think we do.